Chapter 1. Our family, the Taos, lived in a compound with more than 50 rooms, all surrounded by a wall. Grandfather was head of the family, and he had two sons, Big Uncle and my father. Both of them lived there with their wives and children and their own servants. Each family had a set of rooms grouped around a courtyard. Although I spent most of the time in our own rooms with my parents, my two elder sisters, and my little brother, I often visited the courtyards. When I was a baby, my wet nurse had been a sturdy woman from the country who had lost her own baby and had milk to spare. After I was too old to nurse, I loved to climb up on her lap and listen to her tell stories. I noticed that she spoke differently from the other people in our household. She was sent away when I was 4, and there were times when I desperately missed her kindly face, her warm embrace, and her lilting country accent. My parents hired an ama, or governess, to replace her. My ama spoke in a soft, ladylike manner, but she had hard eyes that never missed a thing. I hated her constant teaching and corrections, and I tried to annoy her by talking back, using my old nurse's accent. An even better way of annoying my ama was to run and hide when she called me. This was exactly what I was doing on the day when I first met my fiancé. At the time, I was not quite 5 years old, but because my ama had bound feet, I could run a lot faster, and I didn't have any trouble escaping from her. I skipped through the round gates that led from one courtyard to another. I found a fragrant, sweet olive bush to crouch behind and stifled my giggles as I heard my ama calling, and again, I don't know how to say this, San Zhao, Little Miss 3. Soon her voice lost its usual oily smoothness and became shrill. Then I heard another voice. Aileen, we're having mooncakes, said second sister. Grandmother is entertaining guests in her room. Mooncakes. I loved those little rich round cakes filled with sweet bean paste, nuts, lotus seeds, and other good things. I poked my head out from the bush. Here I am. I bet I could stay here for a month without ever being found. Second sister laughed, but my ama was not amused. She seized my wrist in a grip that hurt, but loosened when she saw I winced. I knew she would think of some way to punish me later, but not while second sister was watching. Who are grandmother's guests? I asked as we hurried through 2 gates on our way to the courtyard where my grandparents lived. Young Mrs. Liu and her son, said second sister. She stopped and looked at me. Your collar is buttoned wrong. You're supposed to look your best, grandmother said. Well, why do I have to look my best? I demanded. My ama undid the top button of my collar and pushed it through its proper loop. Second sister smiled. Since eldest sister and I are all fixed up, it's your turn now. She wet a finger and used it to wipe away a smudge on my cheek. I don't understand, I said. What do you mean by being all fixed up? She means their marriages have been arranged, said Amal with a smirk. So it's time for little Miss 3's marriage to be arranged too. Mind you, I think you're still quite too young, said second sister. You're not quite 5. I couldn't help but grinning at second sister, who was only 13, but stood smoothing her hair and trying to look like a grown-up. Maybe she hoped people would mistake her for grandmother. It's never too early to have your marriage settled, said my ama. Some babies are engaged before they're even born. I laughed. They can't do that. What if the babies turn out to be both girls or both boys? I wasn't quite sure what marriage meant, but I did know that it involved one of each kind, not 2 boys or 2 girls. Don't be stupid, snapped my ama. She stopped and said more quietly, of course, the families would cancel the engagement if both babies turned out to be of the same sex. Come on, we'd better hurry, said second sister, or grandmother will get mad. Always happy to see and visit grandmother, I immediately ran on ahead. Every now and then I stopped and waited impatiently for my ama and second sister. They followed more slowly, swaying gently and taking small, mincing steps because of their bound feet. At the entrance to grandmother's room, my ama bowed and left as second sister and I entered and greeted grandmother. Come in, said grandmother impatiently. What took you so long? She turned to the guests. These two silly scamps are my granddaughters, and their only aim in life is to make my old age miserable. I wasn't fooled by grandmother's crusty manner. I knew she would let me get away with almost anything. Grandfather was a little more frightening, but he spent all his time in the study reading dusty books, so I didn't have to see much of him. The only grown-up who really scared me was Big Uncle, Father's eldest brother. He and Father spent a lot of time together, and Big Uncle was always criticizing little girls who were too fresh. Grandmother wore her usual long satin tunic over trousers, and on her head she wore a black velvet headband decorated with pieces of carved jade. The guests were a lady and a boy who looked somewhat older than I was, maybe 7 or 8. The lady was elegantly dressed in one of the new fashions that some of my cousins' wives were wearing. It consisted of a silk hip-length tunic worn over a skirt reaching to the ankles. Grandmother always said that women wearing skirts was a scandalous custom adopted from foreigners. I waited to see if Grandma would criticize our guest, but she showed no sign of disapproval. The lady smiled and nodded to us. You can't fool me, Auntie Tao. I already know that second sister is an accomplished young lady who plays the flute and embroiders beautifully. Not much wrong with second sister, admitted Grandmother. It's this little one who drives me mad. Look at her, almost 5 years old and still running around like a boy. Mrs. Lu turned and stared at me. She was smiling, but her narrowed eyes seemed to miss very little. She looks very healthy. I'm sure she'll grow up to be a famous beauty, just like her grandmother. Grandmother snorted. What nonsense. She doesn't stay still long enough to grow up, much less become a beauty. Mrs. Lu continued to study me carefully until I felt like squirming. When her eyes reached my feet, she gave a start. You haven't had her feet bound yet? Grandmother seemed embarrassed. I've been too indulgent, I know. Every time I bring the matter up, my son finds some excuse or another to put it off. There was a silence. Without knowing the reason of it, I could sense that something was wrong. Finally, Mrs. Lu spoke. Once the girl's feet are bound, Auntie Tao, she will stop running around. She will have time for ladylike pursuits, such as embroidering. Embroidering? Oh, I couldn't think of anything worse than sitting on a stool for hours and hours like my sisters, poking a needle through a piece of cloth. As for stopping me from running around, I forgot about embroidering when 2 of Grandmother's maids came in with the refreshments. They poured tea in delicate china cups for the grown-ups. Second sister was counted as one of the grown-ups, and I could tell from her smile that she was very pleased. She picked up her cup in a prim manner and took a dainty swallow. The tea was too hot for her, though, and she sputtered. I had to kind of smother a giggle. Delicious tea, murmured Mrs. Lu. Everybody knows that nothing but the best Dragonwell tea is served at your house, Auntie Tao. Ah, you're a terrible flatterer, Mrs. Lu, said Grandmother. Of course, I gave orders to the tea merchants that he is to send us tea made only from leaves picked early in the morning, before dawn. I was bored by the discussion of tea and concentrated instead on the big plate of glistening brown mooncakes, which were the size of my mouth if I opened it really, really wide. Once, I tried to cram a whole cake into my mouth and nearly choked. Now, I knew that the only way to eat these rich cakes was to take small bites. From just looking at the outside of the cakes, it was hard to tell which ones contained my favorite filling, the one with the duck egg yolk. But I didn't get a chance to pick the one I wanted anyway. Grandmother gave me and the Lu boy each a cake and told us to be quiet and behave. While the grown-ups chatted about a moon viewing party, I nibbled at my cake and looked curiously at the boy. He was chubby and a bit taller than I was. What struck me about his face was that his eyebrows were a little higher up on his forehead than they are for most people. This made him look constantly surprised. He wasn't afraid of choking, and in 3 large bites he finished his cake. As he licked his finger, he stared back at me. I didn't mind his stare. I could outstare all my male cousins. After a moment I asked, "What's your name?" "Han Wei," he said. "I'm 7 years old, and you're only 5, so I'm 2 years older." "Are you going to school yet?" I asked. I was proud of the fact that I had started going to the family school and already knew how to write 3 Chinese characters. "Of Of course I'm going to school, retorted Hanwei. In fact, I'm going to a public school. What's a public school? The only school I knew was the one taught at home by teachers grandfather had hired. A public school is a place where you have lessons together with boys from other families. I was amazed. Other families? Does that mean you meet boys from just about anywhere? Of course not. The boys in my school are only the ones that can afford to pay the fee. It must be really exciting to go out every day and study together with boys from other families, I said wistfully. Yeah, it's all right, said Hanwei indifferently, but I could tell he was pleased by the impression he was making. I even eat lunch at the school with the other students. You mean you all eat the same thing? In our family school, I went back to my parents' rooms for lunch since the cook knew my likes and dislikes. My cousins, too, went back to their rooms. Of course we don't eat the same thing, said Hanwei. My servant brings over my food when it's lunchtime. The other students have their lunches brought, too. But we all sit at the same table, and we can talk as much as we want, if we're not too noisy. I'd love to go to a public school, I said. You can't, said Hanwei. You're a girl. I don't see why a girl can't go to an outside school, I protested. But I did feel a touch of doubt. Already I had learned from Mother and my ama that there were certain things that boys could do that girls couldn't. Anyway, said Hanwei, I can teach you some of the things I study at the school if you want. We learned science. That's about how ice melts and becomes water and things like that. At our family school, we spent most of our time memorizing passages from the classics, even the older boys. What else do you learn in science? I asked, fascinated. We study astronomy, answered Hanwei. That's all about the sun, the moon, and the stars. He proceeded to tell me about eclipses, how the moon got between the sun and the earth. My ama had told me that an eclipse was caused by the heavenly dog trying to eat up the sun, and then we had to beat gongs loudly to scare it away. Hanwei's explanation was utterly enthralling. I couldn't imagine one of my male cousins having the patience to talk to me like this. But the only thing I ever did was jeer at me for being a useless girl. And besides science, we learn English, continued Hanwei. Some of my teachers are big noses, and English is the language they speak. Big noses were the foreign people who came from across the ocean. What are they like, these big noses? I asked. Hanwei's brows climbed even further as he thought. Well, their skin gets very pink when they're hot. Also, they're quite hairy. The hair on the back of their hands can get an inch long. He lowered his voice. One of my friends told me he saw a big nose with his sleeves rolled up. There was hair all the way up his arms. I shuddered. They must be part monkey, those big noses. I've never seen a human with so much hair. Hanwei shook his head. They're human, all right. Once you get to know them, you tend to forget how funny they look. Anyway, I have to work so hard in school that I don't have time to worry about my teacher's big nose or hairy arms. Of all the things Hanwei studied in school, I was most interested in the foreigner's language. Can you speak this English, even if you don't have a big nose? I asked. Of course, said Hanwei. He opened and shut his mouth a few times as he prepared himself. I smiled because he reminded me of the golden carp in our fish pond. Hanwei probably thought I was admiring him because he smiled back. Finally, he managed to deliver his English words, which sounded very strange, different from anything I'd ever heard before. I did my best to repeat them after him. I'm good at repeating sounds, and I infuriate some of my cousins by imitating the way they talk. Hey, that's not bad, said Hanwei. I'll teach you some more English if you want. I was touched by his offer. Well, that's nice of you, but why should you bother? Well, didn't they tell you? Asked Hanwei. He glanced at his mother, who was still talking in a low voice to grandmother. Then he turned back to me and smiled. I'm going to be your husband one of these days.